it's a quarter after 8 on daylight savings time. And there are 2 people who are walking around with handheld mics. So if you would raise your hand, one of them will give you a mic, and when you have the mic in your hand, then it's your turn to speak. And Professor Kennedy will try to respond, and we'll see how much we can cover, but we're going to stop at 9. Okay.
I've left you speechless.
Yeah! Any benefits of decolonization? You talked about the cost.
Well, yeah, I mean, can you hear here? Yeah. Oh, do you want me here?
No, they didn't hear his question.
The question
his
was...
question was, oh, go ahead.
Well, there are any benefits?
Are there any benefits to decolonization? Yeah, I mean, I tried to suggest that the transition from empires to nation states and the idea that sovereignty resides in the people, I mean, that's a good thing. I'm an American, I believe in that, right? But as Ben Rader, who is over here, our old colleague of mine and American historian, reminded me, you know, that the United States went through a very terrible civil war, 70, 80 years after it was founded. These are long-term processes of state construction, I think, and we shouldn't assume that they can happen overnight or immediately. It may be that there'll be a retreat completely from this, but, you know, my view is it's a good idea if we can make it work. But at least in the short term, it's been a struggle. We should also keep in mind, yes, I talked about the negative aspects of this. Let's keep in mind that the largest democracy in the world today is India. Right? And it achieved independence in 1947. It is a remarkable political achievement. It has had difficulties in various ways, but you've got to give it credit. And there are any number of other countries that sort of passed through independence in this period after the Second World War that also have managed to make the transition quite successful. Part of it is due to economic forces as well. I think the East Asian countries have largely been more successful at remaining stable and politically vibrant than some of those in Africa because they've been economically more successful. But I mean, I'm talking on the top of my head. I don't know what I'm saying. But, yeah. I know.
I believe that you said that empires manage the differences among the people in their colonies, that once the colony becomes its own nation state, then they no longer have that management of those individual groups, whether it's religious, ethnic, cultural, whatever. Are there any who have managed to pull it off, to find that balance between the separate cultures and separate interests and still maintain a state?
Yeah.
Or are we just seeing, are we going to see them continue to fragment into smaller and smaller, more ethnocentric groups?
Right, yeah, and that's a good question. Well, let me turn to the United States again. Has been remarkably successful creating a nation state that is not premised upon sort of ethnic or religious or cultural homogeneity, right? But by the same token, you look at the politics that are presidential politics going on today, right? This remains an issue that's highly contested, even in our own country. And of course, one of the problems is exactly sort of what sort of vision of a nation state you want to create. I mean, what's remarkable about the United States is it's a nation, you know, the cliche, a nation of immigrants. So everybody's coming from somewhere else. There isn't that sort of homogeneous whole. If you have a notion of a nation state that is based upon the premise of some kind of a common core ethnicity, identity of some sort, then it's more of a challenge, right? I mean, I think the Germans, that's kind of the notion of a nation state that they embrace. The French, there's a wonderful book a French historian wrote about 20 years ago, Eugen Weber, called Turning Peasants into Frenchmen, or Making Peasants into Frenchmen. And his point is that, you know, until the late 19th century, regional differences, regional dialects, regional identities were far more powerful in various parts of France than any sense of French national identity. This is long after Napoleon, long after the French Revolution, all this kind of stuff. And that what was critical in making that transition, among other things, is, public education, mass public education. And, on one level you might call indoctrination, and another level sort of simply trying to create a sense of common identity. Hard to do in many countries where, they're so poor they really can't provide.
They have different languages.
There are different languages. That's a problem as well. Yeah. There are whole array of issues that make it a real challenge. But I would say, for example, United States is one example of a country that has done that successfully. But I turn again to India, where they have 100 different languages. I mean, it's extraordinary, maybe more. And yet they have managed to create a cohesive state that has been, I think, remarkably successful as what we would sort of generally describe as a nation state. So you can overcome linguistic difference, too, in some respects. It doesn't hurt that India is the largest English-speaking population in the world. They have more people who speak English than others. So, and generally the more educated. But yes, so can it happen? Yeah, it can happen. And it can happen, I think the point is it can happen in a variety of different ways. I don't think there's one recipe for creating a successful state that self-identifies as a nation state. And the boundaries between a nation state and other kinds of states are pretty blurry. That's the other thing. I mean, there's some political scientists who've argued, for example, that many modern states are more state nations than nation states. And the argument there is that, in fact, they're states trying to become nations. And it's a long process. Let me give you one other example of how this is an ongoing process, and I don't think it ever sort of comes to completion. And my example here would be Britain, which created a sense of national identity as British. But that identity is fragmenting, right? And, we had the recent referendum in Scotland, and if there's a vote to leave the EU, there's a very good chance that the Scots will secede and create a separate state. So at that point, here the British nation, as we have conventionally conceived of it since at least 1801, and in some ways from 1706, no longer exist. And that can happen. So.
You mentioned India. I think I read recently, and I'm not sure this is a nationalism problem, but Modi, who is the president there, is trying, it's my understanding, to make India a Hindu state again, and is running into lots of problems with the Christians and the Islam people and all those. Is he interested in make a division of boundaries, or do you have any idea what his plan is?
I think his plan is simply to sort of assert Hinduism and his definition of Hinduism as an integral part of what it means to be India, which of course is an enterprise which by its very nature is going to exclude a lot of people. I mean, the Muslim population in India is huge, yeah, and so it's a disturbing development because it's an attempt to move towards that notion of national identity that is very much tied to sort of, in this case, religious homogeneity. Right? And India has been remarkably successful since its independence, managing to maintain a sense of national identity that doesn't require religious homogeneity. So, yeah, I think it's a troubling move.
National sovereignty.
Yes?
So the nation state, we get national sovereignty, we see millions of people getting killed, we spend billions of dollars to stop tyrants from killing their own people. What's the next evolution for the United Nations in dealing with these, in effect, rogue nation states who do such dastardly things to their people?
I have an answer to that, but I'm going to market it and make millions. Beats me.
Is there an evolution to the United Nations that you see?
I'm not an authority on the United Nations, and I suspect there are people here, and I would look to say some others who might want to speak to the issue, yeah. Because I can't say. And it would be, I mean, if I were talking to freshmen in my world history class, I would pontificate, you know, till the cows come home and making claims of authority. And I've already gone far beyond my true limits, so I won't go any further in this regard.
I was interested in your comments on the neocons being imperialists.
Yes.
And were you speaking in terms of the European model, or were they going to invent a new neocon template for their imperialism? Could you expand on what you meant by that?
Sure. So starting in the 1990s, starting in the 1990s, there was a concerted effort, it seems to me, on the part of the neocons, who were organized in a couple of think tanks, to make the case for, keep in mind, this is in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? We have now a unipolar world. And the neocon position, in some sense, was we're in a position as the United States to assert our will and to reshape the world in our image. And part of that was, you know, claims to democracy. On the other hand, part of it was an embrace of the idea of empire. And they're really quite explicit and open about this. We need to change our view of of empire. That it's not, doesn't need to be a negative thing. That empires, in fact, are necessary to the world. That empires provide order and structure and stability. And so this is very much part of an argument that runs through a number of these neoconservative thinkers. This is something I got interested in shortly after I moved to Washington, D.C. and read an article in the Washington Post by Thomas Ricks, the great journalist who wrote about fiasco, the invasion of Iraq and various other things, in which he sort of traced these various think tanks and the arguments of these groups. And then I started to look into it further. So, I mean, I think this isn't simply a rhetorical use of the term empire. I think it is a notion that the United States, I mean, their view of the end goal of this is not oppression and subjugation and exploitation. They don't see an empire in that sense. But their view of empire is that there is an obligation on the part of the greatest power in the world, the United States, to impose its will to reorder the world. And they readily admit that that means imperialism.
Well, I was going to comment that I think I would say Indonesia would be an example of a country that's somewhat successfully done the transition. They have the problem of being hundreds of islands. They don't have geographic contiguity. They're a Muslim democracy. They have just elected an opposition leader as their new prime minister and had a successful, peaceful transition and have a growing economy.
I couldn't agree with you more. Indonesia is another really fascinating case. And again, it reinforces the point that you can create a nation state out of a disparate group of people. I mean, how you create that sense of an imagined community that Benedict Anderson talks about can come in a variety of different ways. The Indonesians have been remarkably successful, I agree, in creating that sense of an imagined community, of an Indonesian national consciousness, despite the fact that they speak hundreds of different languages. They include a variety of different ethnic groups. There are a number of differences within and of course they're scattered in all these islands. Yeah, it's a remarkable, in many ways that's a remarkable achievement. Of course, keep in mind too, that when was it that they had the...
East Timor.
Well, there was East Timor when they invaded East Timor, but even before that when they murdered about 1 million Chinese people they identified as communists who were Indonesians to impose you know, a more sort of authoritarian regime. So, yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Kennedy, what chance and under what circumstances would this caliphate really come to be successful? You know, if in fact it might come to pass, under what circumstances could that really happen as a substitute for nationalism in effect in the Middle East?
The election of Donald Trump?
Maybe.
It's as good an answer as I can give. I don't know. I haven't a clue. You know, I mean, it doesn't seem to me like a likely outcome because it imposes a kind of, or it presumes the imposition of a kind of uniformity and a turn from practices that are so ingrained and widespread, even across the Middle East, that I just can't envision it actually being successful. So.
One here.
Okay, I have an idea for an imagined community that I wanted to test out on you. In Bhutan, they added the idea of happiness as a complement to gross domestic product. So I think they're calling it gross national happiness. And then I think the United Kingdom has picked up on this now as well. And so I'm imagining a world wherein nations compete on both to have the highest GDP per capita, but also the highest gross national happiness per capita. Maybe as like an alternative way of creating like a cosmopolitanism. So that's my, what do you think of that as an imagined community?
I think it's a great idea. I love it. I love it. No, that's terrific. And it really is interesting that this idea, which starts in Bhutan, right, has taken off and attracted interest in a variety of other ways, other places. And it does point to something I think it's really critical to appreciate, is that, you know, we gotta measure communities and sort of what brings them together and what gives them a sense of identity in a variety of different ways. You know, you can't just do it in terms of gross domestic product or what have you. And yeah, it's a brilliant idea. I don't know how they actually measure this. I'd be curious. And I think you know, that different. I mean, if the British are using it, they're gonna fall way low on the tables. I'm pretty confident they're not gonna make it. So I would advise them to avoid that.
What country or nation would you say takes care of their people well in their new configurations? Do you know of areas or places where their people are pretty well taken care of in their new realities?
Oh, I suppose, I mean, that's kind of impossible to answer, isn't it?
Well, how their governments are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure I'm sure the Singapore government would say we're doing this really, really well, right? Highly organized, very regimented, but also very prosperous, and you know, providing a society that provides all the basic needs for their citizens. You know, doesn't hurt that in fact their economic position is really.
But what's their happiness level?
But what is their happiness level? That's another question, yeah. So, but, you know, I mean, I would just throw that out as one country that sort of fits those kinds of criteria. But, I mean, you know, part of the problem here making these kinds of judgments, I mean, I think any country you look at, you know, it's confronted by its own particular set of circumstances, historical and contemporary circumstances. So to compare them is really a disservice in some ways. By any particular measure. And that's why the Bhutan example is such a terrific one. Tiny little country, poor, and yet, you know, their happiness measurement, if that's legitimate, is quite high. You know,
But we're getting hundreds of refugees a year from Bhutan.
Are you? Oh, okay. Why, do you know?
They're not
I think it's freedom, so that they're minorities can't, are persecuted.
Oh, okay. So, Ghana, yeah. I mean, yeah, you can point to Botswana and South Africa, and you know, there are a variety of places you can point to that seem to have been
Seems
remarkably successful.
like there's such a lack of leadership, and that, say that with this craziness going on in the presidential election and so on. But do we only recognize leadership in after we've benefited from it, you know,
Well, again, this is contextual, isn't it? I mean, you know, leadership, I think leaders can, I mean, some of them can be just terrible, right? But some of them are faced by certain constraints that make success very difficult, if not impossible, you know? So,
people that we have felt have been leaders are now demonized, and, you know, it's a crazy world when you try to analyze what works and what doesn't.
yes, it is. It's a crazy world. I'll agree with that. That's one of the best summaries, I think.
I'll put a plug in for the Nordic region.
Okay, there we are, sure.
I'd just like to comment about Singapore. The first time I went there, I thought it was a charming, civilized country, even though they flogged people for chewing gum, etc. But when I was last there about a year and a half ago, I actually was uncomfortable in the city, state, country because of the day laborers that come. So you can say what you want about high education, valuing professionals, and the almighty dollar, but at what expense? They had just had a big road race or Formula something. They'd had something else that brought a lot of tourists. But seeing the conditions of the day laborers, 10 o'clock at night in soiled t-shirts, being loaded into what, except that they had motors, they otherwise looked like covered wagons with dirty canvas to go back across the causeway. Some apparently were, I don't know, I wouldn't call them landed immigrants, but they were Pakistanis in terms of their citizenship, and they were actually living in Singapore. But I would not go real far in holding up that country either. I mean, I think it just shows that it depends on what aspect, what facet you're looking at.
Yeah. And of course, you raise another issue that I think is really interesting. I mean, they're able to do that, of course, because those people are not considered Singaporeans, right? They're not part of that community, of that nation state, if you will. And of course, what's happening there is happening all over the place. It's happening in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf states. It's happening here. It's happening a number of places. And so one of the costs that comes with the creation of the nation state is the universal template for organizing international relations, is that it also leads to those people who are left in the margins, or sort of drawn out. I mean, demand for labor from people who are not given the legal rights of citizens because they are, migrant laborers, and that's a huge problem today. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Yes.
I would not be the first.
I would not be the first academic or observer to raise the question of civil society. Thinking about the United States and the ability to overcome a lot of the challenges that were pretty dramatic through the late 1800s and early 1900s, trade labor unions, and ultimately an external threat of World War II delivered a lot of opportunity for people to cut across those kinds of divisions. To what degree do you think there are real opportunities for that kind of articulation of civil society elsewhere in a world that is increasingly parceled out and influenced by transnational corporations.
Yeah. Jeez, I knew this would happen. Let me remind you, I'm a historian. Talking about the past. One time, see, I'm going to avoid your question. Early in my career, I went to Kenya to do research on my first book, and while I was there was this attempted coup. They tried to overthrow this guy, Daniel Arap Moi, who was president of Kenya at the time. And so I was there in Nairobi while this was happening, shooting going on, people getting killed, all this kind of stuff. And I came back home, and people said, you need to write about this, so write a journalistic piece about what you saw in your observations. So I did, and I wrote this essay that the Nation magazine actually published. And at the end of that essay, I predicted that Daniel Arap Moi's days as president were numbered, even though the coup had failed. Give him another year or two. Well, he lasted another 20 years. So my point is, I'm a historian. I'm not going to predict.
This question really is about myth-making, that is nationalism.
Yeah.
The United States has done a pretty decent job in terms of binding its people together by creating a common narrative, which involves having to believe in a lot of things that simply aren't true. To what extent, right, myths, so to what extent have these newer nations, these decolonized nations, used history or created a history, a national narrative, again, perhaps based on myth, in order to bind various elements together?
Oh, I think all of them try to do that. Absolutely all of them try to do that. And one of the things that was so striking, once independence takes place, there's this concerted effort on the part of all these countries to create national histories, to write national histories. The UNESCO series on history of Africa was, in some respects, sort of an internationalization of that kind of project. Yes, it involves a good deal of myth-making. If you, again, I can talk best about some of those countries I've looked at most closely, but if you look at the case of India, much of the historiography for the first 20, 30 years of India's existence as an independent nation was very much a kind of rah-rah nationalist history, the heroism of the nationalist leaders and so on. And then you had this sort of backlash against this by a new group of so-called subaltern historians who are saying, that's nonsense, and there are different groups that are pursuing different sorts of agendas, and so everybody does it.
Is there any correlation as to the availability of resources, as to the ability or the success or failure of a lot of these new countries? Several years ago, there was a lot of journalistic efforts going on saying that oil was a curse rather than a benefit. And so, can you predict how some of these countries are going to turn out based on their natural resources, their agricultural economy, or what other factors?
I'm a historian. I would say no. I would say no. Just look at the Congo, all right? Extraordinary resources, and it's been a basket case. Right? You can look at other countries. The resources are marginal, but have managed to do very well. So resources can potentially be a benefit if they're exploited and employed usefully for the benefit of the country, but there are any number of factors that might prevent that from happening, and especially if there is not a strong civil society, if there's not a strong set of political institutions. What often happens, of course, is that those resources are exploited for the benefit of a small elite who sort of send their money to banks in Switzerland. So, no, yeah. Uh-oh. Now I know I'm in trouble.
We're all in trouble because of this microphone.
for the historian. You had that nice quote about Ghana and Nkrumah saying, we should get away from these subnational identities, and this is chauvinistic, and we need to just talk about the nation. When you look back as a historian, isn't it prevalent that some politicians just can't resist stirring up these subnational factors for their own power, whether in Kenya, which you know about, it might be an ethnic identity, the most numerous ethnic group, or in Iraq under al-Maliki would be the Shia and running a government that was basically favorable to the Shia. Or if you go back to federal Yugoslavia, Milosevic just couldn't help himself but stir up Serb identity and Serb nationalism. Isn't that the big problem? Which is, we could talk about Donald Trump as well, about stirring up identities and hostilities toward the outgroup and that sort of thing. Isn't that conscious drive for power what often undermines this imagined national community? The politicians refer to all these subnational things because it's their path to power or keeping power. And so as you look back, would you agree with that or say, no, that's off base?
I think there's no question that political leaders often are self-interested. There's no doubt about that, right? I mean, they're and again, Donald Trump and his egomania is a perfect example. But, so that's, I wouldn't say that's the exclusive or necessarily the dominant factor that accounts for success or failures for these countries. I'm certainly it is an important factor, but one has to then ask what sort of forces lead these folks to decide that it is in their interest to provoke these kinds of ethnic rivalries and tensions and advance one group over another rather than pursuing a different strategy that might also bring them power, right? I mean, that doesn't have to be the only way in which you sort of maintain power or create control over a state or make a state that, I mean, keep in mind too that many of these states are very weak. And part of the problem is how to actually build the state itself, right? And in building the state, often, sure, you rely upon your friends, your family, your ethnic group because you know that they're trustworthy. It may not necessarily be because you want to screw the other guy, but because if you turn to someone else who's not part of that group, are you sure they're actually going to sort of pursue the agenda of the leadership? So I think there are just a lot of factors that account for the decisions that are made by these figures, and it's not just sort of selfish self-interest on the part of these leaders. That would be my... In other words, the historian's common perennial answer, it's complicated.
There's no profit in prophecy.
Would you want to comment on the case of Tanzania? My understanding is that Julius Nyerere made a conscious effort to detribalize Tanzania and to move people into villages across tribal boundaries and to create a national education system. Do you have a sense that that worked? Was it constructive or was it oppressive? What's your take on the Tanzanian model?
Honestly, I just don't know enough about it to be able to offer any kind of educated comment on it. One thing that just does occur to me, though, in that context, I mean, one of the things that's, if I'm not mistaken, and people can correct me here, one of the things that's striking about Tanzania is that you don't have, say, 2 or 3 dominant ethnic groups, right? It's a lot more fragmented, which in some ways may have served his agenda better. Where you look north at Kenya, and you have the Gikuyu, you have the Luo, you have a couple of really dominant ethnic groups, and consequently the fault lines between them are starker than I think was the case in Tanzania among the ethnic groups there. And again, there's the issue of sort of by what measures do we determine success, right? Economically, Tanzania has been not a success. Politically, it's been stable, and it hasn't had sort of the egregious tyrants that we've seen in some other parts of Africa. So in those terms, you know, I think they've done okay. But exactly why, I can't tell you.
We have one here.
Of the former colonial powers, this is kind of a ranking question, if you will, and should be.
Well, the British are on top, obviously.
It should be good for a historian. Of the 7 or 8, what are the 1 or 2 best and 1 or 2 worst of those former colonial powers in terms of providing a good launching pad for the former colonies as they got independence? And I'm not talking about in terms of, you know, the effect on the colonial power, people returning to it and so forth, but rather the best job, intentional or unintentional, of providing a framework for them to succeed.
Again, I'm going to skim slightly around that question because in part it presumes that one can sort of measure them on equal terms, but for example, so the British Empire was much larger and in many places started earlier than some of these other empires. On the other hand, the Portuguese are the first, and they were in Africa and India before any of the other European powers, and they didn't make much of a success of it. So I guess I wouldn't credit the Portuguese as having been particularly successful in helping. But it wasn't their intention. It was never their design. It was never the design of any of these powers, seriously, to bring these peoples and these territories to independence. What's clear is that the British and the French in particular, less so the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the Belgians, certainly claimed the rhetoric of world imperialism, that their ultimate goal was to bring these people up to a standard in which they could govern themselves. So that was always, I mean, from the 19th century at least on, that claim was always widespread among the British and French imperialists. But the question was always, so when does that happen? And none of them ever sort of made that transition of their own free will, it seems to me. They fought and struggled against it as long as they possibly could. The British did, the French did, the Portuguese did, the Dutch did, the Belgians did. Every one of them resisted. And it was only the force of circumstances, the pressure of particular sort of political and economic constraints that caused them to move out. Now, the British in India, for example, I mean, they were there long enough to create a panoply of institutions modeled on their own in some ways, legal institutions, political institutions, and because they had been there a long time, those institutions, I think, were sort of sufficiently rooted to survive after independence. But I wouldn't argue that the British sort of said this was what we wanted in 1947.
Yes, I'd like to shift your perspective, not as a historian, but to another part of the world. Would you say that the decolonization of the Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere could be considered within that top group as successful?
By what measure?
And that they are nation states. They established their independence from the country, and
And they maintain still a connection with that country in a positive way. And they still maintain the dominance of the language, some of the culture, and certainly the religious beliefs.
Yeah, that's all true. Yeah. So were they
Successful in that they continue to be stable, independent states.
Well, not always stable. I mean, over their history from independence, a lot of them have been incredibly unstable politically, right? And have often been at war with one another and the like. So, political stability, economic success, mixed. Certainly the dominance of Spanish language, Spanish tradition, Spanish culture, Spanish institutions, very powerful. That's the case. Yeah. One of the things I think is interesting to keep in mind, and just to shift the focus a little bit, if you think about decolonization as a series of waves, all right, starting in the Americas, one of the things that's striking, and this gets back to the point from my response to you, one of the things that's striking is that each of those waves come in the aftermath or in the process of global wars between empires. So you have the 7 Years' War between the French and the British and their allies, which helps to destabilize British control over North America. You have the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, which help to destabilize Spanish and French and Portuguese control in the Americas. And we have these independence movements that arise as a result of that. I mean, it's the conflict between these great empires that weaken them to a degree that it becomes possible for these local elites, these local groups, to claim some degree of autonomy. You look at the second wave, I argue, that takes place in Central and Eastern Europe. In the aftermath of the First World War, this was a war between empires. Quite definitely. And it brings about the collapse of some of those empires and the creation of new independent nation states. And the third wave comes, not surprisingly, in the aftermath of World War II. In World War II, it seems to be as absolutely critical in undermining the authority, the legitimacy, the economic wherewithal for these empires to maintain their control. And it takes a while in some cases, right? Portuguese, oddly enough, are the last to decolonize. They also don't fight in the Second World War. But I think that sort of longer historical trajectory is useful to keep in mind in thinking about what happens and what's driving this. And that would be partly, in response to your question when I was making the case that none of them do it willingly.
Same thing is true in 1989 in Central Asia?
I would say the same thing is true. There is a fourth wave that comes with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is another empire. Absolutely. The collapse of the Soviet Union leads to a fourth wave of decolonization, and a whole slew of new nation states come into existence.
That was my question. We didn't talk about that. We also, earlier in the 20th century, we had the Ottoman Empire that collapsed, and that was creating new Middle East. And now, toward the end, 1990, the Soviet collapsed. And not only Eastern Europe, the traditional nations became state again, but also a whole bunch of states within the Soviet Union broke up too. And that didn't follow any of the examples you said, but so it's the fourth class.
Yeah, it's a fourth wave, and arguably it's a result of a global war between empires too. It's the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union that ultimately undermines the authority of the Soviet Union and leads to its collapse.
I think the children would have.
Well, that brings us to a conclusion. It's 9 o'clock. Thank you, Dr. Kennedy.